What's up guys? Welcome to another tier list. Y'all seem to like my MegaTen tier list, so I figured why not also do one for another one of my favorite franchises, Castlevania. In this video, I'm going to be ranking all the Castlevania games in tiers using this tier maker tier list created by yours truly. And yeah, there's not a lot to say. Let's get on with it. But first, let me give a shout out to this video's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Saga of Sins and Daredrop. Saga of Sins is a brand new action RPG from indie developer Bonus Level Entertainment and publisher Just 4 Games. It has a beautiful stained glass art style inspired by the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch, with an engaging story that follows the efforts of a medieval Catholic priest who exorcises sinners that will lead you to one of several possible endings. In this game, you'll traverse dungeons and engage in some exciting 2D side-scrolling gameplay with some great exploration, combat, and boss battles. You can download this game right now on Steam. However, Saga of Sins is also currently running a promotion with Daredrop, a platform that allows content creators to participate in and complete challenges for rewards, like this one right here. All I gotta do is beat this game's first major boss, and I get a Steam key for Ganryu 2. How cool is that? There will be plenty of other games Daredrop will be doing dares for in the future, and many others going on right now. Check out the link right now down below in the description to participate. I want to give a big thank you to Just 4 Games and Daredrop for sponsoring this video, and now that that's out of the way, let's get back to the video. Now, let's start by getting the games in the not played category out of the way, those being Haunted Castle, Vampire Killer, Kid Dracula, Grimoire of Souls, and some of the more obscure ones like Encore of the Night. I actually do own this game on an old jailbroken iPod Touch, and I've played a tiny bit of it, but not enough for me to appropriately include it in this list, though I may do a video on it in the future. And then there's the arcade, which I've also played a tiny bit of, but this game is rare. Like, the only arcade that has it to my knowledge is the Galloping Ghost arcade in Chicago, and I am going to be at ASIN this year, and I am planning to play it while I'm there, so maybe I'll do a video on it, but yeah, if you live near that area, you're more than welcome to check it out, but yeah, let's get on with the rest of this list. Let's start from the very beginning with Castlevania 1 on NES, or Famicom if you're in Japan, and I think I'm gonna put this game in the B tier. Don't get me wrong, I love Castlevania 1, I mean, it's one of my favorite action games on the NES, probably my favorite third-party game on that system out of what I've played, but I put it here in B just because, you know, with it being the first of its kind, over the past 35 years, a lot of the games that followed have been able to improve upon it. It's pretty bare bones compared to the ones that came after. You can only play as Simon, the level design is mostly linear, but still, the gameplay, graphics, and music are all great for the time, and no matter how old this game gets, going through Dracula's castle and whipping monsters will never get old. Now we move on to Simon's Quest. This is pretty divisive among fans for reasons, but in all fairness, Simon's Quest is a decent game, especially for its time. A lot of sequels to popular games on NES were radically different from their predecessors, and this is one of them, but I mean, it's nowhere near on the same level as something like Zelda 2 or Super Mario Bros. 2, at least the American version, but anyway, Simon's Quest was the first game in the series to take on a non-linear playstyle. You could say that it was the granddaddy of Symphony of the Night and the other Metroidvania-style games that came after. You could visit towns, buy items, talk to NPCs, stuff like that. It even has a leveling system where once you get enough hearts, your maximum health will increase. Another thing that's cool is how it has multiple endings, something that wasn't very common back then. That being said, a lot of the criticisms toward this game are valid. A lot of the NPCs aren't really helpful at all, mainly due to a poor translation on Konami's part. Some of the secrets are really tough to figure out, and pretty much impossible without a guide. And then some people also don't like the day-night cycle. I don't have too much of a problem with this, but it is kind of annoying when you want to go to the village at night and everything is closed. Overall, Simon's Quest was a unique entry in the Castlevania series at the time. It tried some new things, some of it worked, some of it didn't, but it is a good game. I wouldn't say it's as polished as Castlevania 1 or 3, and it's why I have it in C tier. Now on to Castlevania 3, and I think I'm gonna put this in B. Castlevania 3 is just simply a great game. It's basically Castlevania 1 on steroids. It got rid of the RPG elements and open-endedness of Simon's Quest, but it does have branching paths, which is really cool, and it also has multiple endings. Plus, it has multiple playable characters, another first for the series. You can only have one with you at a time, but that's part of what makes this game replayable. Not only can you replay the game and take different paths, but you can also play it again while choosing to keep and get rid of certain characters. I also think the story is really cool. I mean, there's not much in the game itself, because that's kind of how most NES games were, but it laid the foundation for the Netflix series, as well as Curse of Darkness, and many of the succeeding games refer to the story as well. So yeah, Dracula's Curse is a good game. I don't know if I would say it's better than Castlevania 1, mainly because of its brutally unforgiving difficulty, even for NES standards, but it's definitely worthy of being in the same tier. Up next, we have none other than Super Castlevania 4, and I think this game deserves to be put in A. I know Castlevania 4 is a somewhat controversial game among fans. A lot of people say it's too easy because of the way it allows you to whip in every direction, and you can easily cheese your way through some parts of the game by doing this. There's also the fact that some of the innovations that were made in Castlevania 3 didn't make it into Castlevania 4, but Castlevania 4 is just such a good game that gets so many things right. For such an early SNES game, the graphics are beautiful, and the music, amazing. And the level design is outstanding, and the gameplay is a lot of fun. It's also a little on the longer side, which is great because that means more Castlevania. Overall, Castlevania 4 is a game that I can understand why it's controversial among veteran players, especially those seeking a challenge, but it is still a very well-made and fun game that builds upon everything that made Castlevania 1 great, and I definitely think it's worthy of the A tier. Alright, so up next we have the famous Rondo of Blood, and I think this deserves to be in... Honestly, I was originally going to put it in A, but I think I'm actually going to put it in S tier. I absolutely love Rondo of Blood. I mean, what can you say about this game that hasn't already been said by millions? Rondo of Blood is an amazing game with some gorgeous graphics and a soundtrack that is so good it even puts Castlevania 4's soundtrack to shame. I mean, it's so good we wouldn't even get this version in English officially until 2007, mainly due to it being exclusive to the PC Engine CD, which wasn't a very popular console in North America or Europe. Rondo of Blood brought back a lot of the innovations that were made in Castlevania 3, like the branching paths, a new playable character, and all with a new 16-bit coat of paint. And the new technology provided by the CD allowed them to really innovate and make it one of the best 2D side-scrollers ever. Unfortunately, like I said, we wouldn't get this game in North America until much later, but we would get a port to the SNES, that being Castlevania Dracula X. And, yeah, Castlevania Dracula X isn't that great. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still a good game, but it's very much a poor man's version of Rondo of Blood. For one thing, you can only play as Richter, no more Maria, and while it does have branching paths, it only has 2 of them, and some of the levels are just outright missing, and many of the existing ones have been redesigned, and not really in a good way. Dracula X is an okay game, and I imagine it was probably a great experience for Western fans that didn't know or have any way to play Rondo of Blood back in the day, and normally I would put it in B tier, but the fact that this game is a port of one of the best classic Vania games, I feel like I really have to bump it down to C. Alright, now onto the first Castlevania game on a Sega console, Castlevania Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis, and yeah, I like Bloodlines. I'm gonna put it in A. Bloodlines is quite an interesting game. It doesn't have you playing as any of the Belmonts, you instead play as either John Morris, who is the son of Quincy Morris, heavily based on the character of the same name from the Bram Stoker novel, and he uses the same whip the Belmonts use, or Eric Lecard, who uses a spear. Now, at the time Bloodlines came out, this was the last Castlevania game chronologically set in 1914 during World War I. Now, with this being a game set in a not really modern, but modern by Castlevania standards, and it also taking place all over Europe rather than just inside Dracula's castle, this allowed them to really get creative with the level design of this game. I wouldn't say Bloodlines is the best Castlevania in terms of the structure of its design, but artistically, it's probably my favorite classic Castlevania game. There's just so much creativity here, and these environments are just so cool. And with this game coming out on a less powerful system and toward the end of its lifespan, they didn't really have to push the Genesis to its limits, but they did. And this is one of the more technically impressive games on the system. The only complaint I really have is the limited number of continues, and while it's not as bad as Castlevania 3, this is without doubt the hardest of the 16-bit Castlevania games. It's tough to say whether or not it's better than Castlevania 4, but it is definitely worthy of being in the same tier. Alright, now before I move on to the Metroidvanias and 3D Vanias, let's get the Game Boy series out of the way. Starting with the Adventure, and yeah, I hate to be that guy, but the Adventure just isn't that good. The graphics and music are good for the Game Boy, but the level design is just bad, and this game is unfairly difficult. I mean, yeah, a lot of the other games I've talked about and will be talking about later are difficult, but in the case of the Adventure, it just feels artificial and unfair, and a lot of the difficulty curve comes from trial and error. This might have been done to pad out the game, seeing as how there are only 3 levels, but come on, there are better ways to do this than by making the game frustratingly difficult, and even on its own, the level design still isn't that good. Not to mention, I don't know what it is, but the Adventure's gameplay just feels sluggish, and there are no sub-weapons. Like, why? Normally I'd give this game a bit of mercy and blame most of its shortcomings on the limitations of the hardware, but Belmont's Revenge was actually pretty decent, and speaking of, let's put that in B. Belmont's Revenge is everything the first game should have been. The level design is better, it's longer, and a lot of that sluggishness of the first game is gone. I also think it's really cool how the game takes place across different castles with different themes, and you can beat them in any order. So, yeah, overall, Belmont's Revenge is a decent game. And now there is one more Castlevania game for the Game Boy, that being Legends. And Legends is, well, it's a game. Out of all the Castlevania games ever made, this is definitely one of them. Now, this game comes under fire from fans for not really being necessary, and I kind of agree. I mean, this was an attempt to be sort of an origin story for the series, but now it's not even considered canon, but I don't know. I don't really think Legends is all that bad, but I don't think it's really all that good either. For the Game Boy, the graphics are great, and the level design is solid. The music is kind of and the gameplay just feels like a step down from Belmont's Revenge. Another thing that's dumb is that there's no version of it in color unlike the other 2 Game Boy games got. Overall, Legends isn't a horrible game, but I'd still say it's a step down from Belmont's Revenge, so I'm gonna be putting it between Adventure and Belmont's Revenge in the C tier. Okay, let's move on to the Metroidvania style games, starting with the first, Symphony of the Night. Now, don't get me wrong, guys, I love Symphony of the Night. It is a beautifully designed game that is a lot of fun to play, but it's not my favorite Metroidvania. Honestly, I think as far as the Metroidvania Castlevania games go, Symphony of the Night is kind of overrated, and I wouldn't put it in the S tier, but I will put it in A. Now, Symphony of the Night was the first game to take on the Metroidvania style, and it pretty much created the genre. It's a side-scrolling action game that's designed like an RPG, and it has a non-linear structure, along with dozens of equipable weapons and items, and there's just so much to do. Dracula's castle is huge, and exploring it is so much fun. I say it's overrated because, while it doesn't do anything bad, I just think most of the later games in this style are better. For one thing, it can get confusing at times, and without a guide, it's not always clear about what you're supposed to do. But what I really hate is when the game makes you think you're able to move on, but aren't. Now, that being said, there are several things I think Symphony of the Night does better than some of the other Metroidvanias, like the music. I think Symphony of the Night has the best music out of all of these games, which is in no small part due to it being the only one on a CD-based console, making for the best audio quality. It's also the most content-rich of the Metroidvanias, with it having a bunch of hidden secrets and optional bosses and places to explore, and that's even more the case with the Saturn version. Symphony of the Night is a great game, but I don't know if I would say it's a masterpiece, so I'm only gonna put it in A, although it probably is the best of all the A-tier games. Alright, next up we have good old Circle the Moon. This game was developed by Konami's Kobe studio, the same developers behind Castlevania 64, and this is a launch title for the Game Boy Advance. Circle of the Moon is a game that I heard a lot of mixed opinions on, but I really like this game, and I think it deserves to be an A tier. Circle of the Moon is kind of a weird in-between of classic Castlevania and Metroidvania. For example, your only weapon is the whip, but this game has a non-linear structure. There's still equipable armor and accessories and consumable items, but there's no shop. Everything is RNG based. Some people like it that way because it forces you not to rely on the random drop rate, and it can be rewarding when you get an item when you're not even trying. although it can also be equally frustrating when you're trying to get a rare item with no luck. The overall design of the castle is really good, the music is great for the GBA, and for a launch title, it isn't too bad graphically either, and the DSS card system is really cool. It's also pretty short, much shorter than Symphony of the Night, but for what it is, I think it's just the right length, and it definitely deserves its spot in A tier. Alright, up next we have Harmony of Dissonance, and I don't know what it is, but there's just something about Harmony of Dissonance that doesn't click with me. This was the first Metroidvania that Igarashi worked on since Symphony of the Night, and his goal was to make a successor to Symphony of the Night, but if you ask me, it just falls flat. For one thing, there's the graphics. Harmony of Dissonance has this really bright color scheme which just looks jarring. Now, to be fair, this game was designed with the Game Boy Advance in mind, and one of the biggest complaints people had with Circle of the Moon was that it was hard to see, because remember, the Game Boy Advance had no light, like, at all. So this is a smart move on Konami's part, but in the long run, it hurt the game more because nowadays, if you're playing on the DS or the Advance Collection or some other backlit screen, you could see the game just fine, and now it just looks stupid. Another thing is that the music just sucks. And it's not even because its composition is bad, in this case, it's because they ended up using more of the GBA's resources for the graphics and had less for the sound. The story I also just find uninteresting, and the design of the castle is nowhere near as good as it was in Symphony of the Night, but the gameplay is still good, and the bosses are good too. Harmony of Dissonance isn't a bad game, but it's just not very memorable, and most of what it does is done better in other games, and it currently sits as my least favorite of the Metroidvania Castlevanias, earning its spot in B tier. However, the exact opposite is true for Aria of Sorrow, which easily earns its spot in the SS tier. I freaking love Aria of Sorrow. Everything I love about Castlevania, Aria of Sorrow excels at, and then some. Great artwork? Check. Fun combat? Check. Interesting environments to explore? Check. Even the story is good. The only aspect I would say Aria of Sorrow is kind of weak in is the sound design, but it's still much better than Harmony of Dissonance. Unlike the other games that take place in the past, Aria takes place in the future, and in it, you don't fight Dracula, you are Dracula, or you're Dracula's heir trying to resist the urge to turn into him. The design of the castle, the enemies, the bosses are all some of the best this series has to offer, and that's also true for the equipment and items you can get. This game has some of the most fun to use weapons in the series, and they were able to really get creative with some of these thanks to the futuristic setting. I could gush about Aria of Sorrow for ages, but right now, I also have to rank the next game in the Sorrow duology, that being Dawn of Sorrow for the DS, which I will also put in SS. Now, I did say in my handgun only video that I thought Dawn of Sorrow was a bit better, but now that I've recently replayed the two, honestly, I would say that I just slightly prefer Aria over Dawn, but that is a very small gap, and I still think Dawn of Sorrow is a masterpiece in its own right. The reasons that I say this are because Dawn of Sorrow has that gimmick where you have to pull out your stylus and connect these dots in a pattern in order to beat bosses. I mean, it's not a big deal early on, but later on, when the patterns get harder and the bosses get harder, it really becomes tedious and frustrating. Plus, there's also the generic anime art, which, I mean, I think it's fine since Dawn takes itself a lot less seriously than the other games, but I still don't think it's as good as Kojima's art style. However, the combat and the level design are on par with, if not better than Aria of Sorrow, and the music is freaking amazing. Even though it's not up to the quality sound of the PS1, it is still a huge step up from the GBA, and it's some of the best music the system has to offer in my opinion, and overall, Dawn of Sorrow definitely earns its spot in the SS tier. Alright, where was I? Oh yeah, up next on the list is Portrait of Ruin, another semi-modern set Castlevania and a sequel to Bloodlines, and I think I'm going to put this one in S. Portrait of Ruin is once again another Metroidvania-style game, but this time it has two protagonists that you can swap between and even fight side by side with. Now, you may be thinking that with the DS's wireless communication features, that would mean that you could do co-op, but unfortunately that's only possible in the game's boss rush mode. However, one thing that is cool about Portrait of Ruin is how you can explore different worlds by jumping into paintings and brings back a lot of the diverse environments that Bloodlines had. It also uses the same generic anime style that Dawn of Sorrow did, but here I actually think it's less appropriate because this game tries to be more serious, but it's just hard to take seriously when characters are making facial expressions like this. One thing that is cool though is that Portrait of Ruin is just loaded to the brim with content. It's pretty long, and it has a ton of extra optional bosses and modes that let you play as not 1 or 2, but 5 different additional characters, including an axe armor, and that's pretty cool. Plus, it has the level 1 hard mode for players seeking a masochistic challenge. Of course, the music is also god tier, and Invitation of a Crazed Moon is probably my favorite opening song in the whole series, and all this comes together to help this game earn its spot in the S tier. And last but not least, we have Order of Ecclesia, the last Metroidvania Castlevania game, and I'm also going to put this in S. I'll be honest, I wasn't a fan of this game at first. I thought the idea of there being this overworld with villages to explore and whatnot was dumb. I thought the side quests were tedious, and I wasn't really digging the art style either. But when I went back to play it again, I stuck with it, and I'm glad I did. Order of Ecclesia has some really good level design, really good music, great boss battles, and I think the glyph system is a lot of fun, and the environments that you fight in are cool too. Even the story is kind of interesting, and it had some pretty interesting characters and plot twists. And for those of you that still wanted a good old-fashioned Castlevania experience, well, Dracula's Castle is still in this game. Yeah, Dracula's Castle is one of the places you can go to in this game, and you may think since it's just another area that it'll be short like all the others, but nope. When you get into Dracula's Castle, you still have a good half the game left, and that's pretty cool. So yeah, overall, Order of Ecclesia is great, and a decent send-off for the Metroidvania Castlevania games. It is still probably my least favorite of the DS trilogy though, but the fact that it's still an S really goes to show how good these games are. Alright, that's going to be it for the Metroidvanias, and before I get into the 3D entries, there are a couple more I want to get out of the way first, like Order of Shadows, and yeah, this one's gonna go in E. Most of you probably haven't even heard of this one, and that's because it's an original Castlevania game made for Java phones. Now, there are other Castlevania games on Java phones, but most of them are just butchered remakes of existing ones. This one was actually made exclusively for this, and if you don't know what Java phones are, well, if back in the day you had one of those flip phones or keypad phones, you probably played games on them, and that's what these games are. Most of them not being very good due to hardware and software limitations, and Java phones are basically what you had if you were too poor to afford an iPhone or an Android. But getting back to the game, I mean, it plays exactly how you might expect a Castlevania game for Java phones would. Not very well. The graphics are muddy, the animations are choppy, and the controls are just ugh. The music is okay, but get this, when you start the game, you choose to hear either music or have sound effects. I mean, I get that that's a Java thing, but still. So, yeah, Order of Shadows, bad game. And let's move on to a much better game, that being the Adventure Rebirth. Another somewhat obscure one, and I think I'm going to put this in S. Honestly, the Adventure Rebirth might just be my favorite Classicvania game. It was released in 2009 as an exclusive for WiiWare, but you know what? It's pretty freaking good. It brings Castlevania back to its roots with a touch of modernness, and while it's advertised as a remake of the original game, it's really more of a reimagining with entirely new levels and bosses. There's really not a whole lot to say. It's basically just a love letter to classic Castlevania, and it does everything that those games did really well. And it all comes together for a really great package that I think any fan of classic Castlevania should play. Alright, now on to the 3D games, starting with Castlevania 64, which I will put in... yeah, I think I'm going to put you in C. Much like Simon's Quest, Castlevania 64 suffers from a really bad case of it being the first of its kind. It was the beginning of the 3D age of gaming. A lot of franchises were making that big jump. Some worked, some didn't, and while this game was positively received when it came out, it later started getting a bad reputation thanks to certain internet gaming personalities, but really, it's really not that bad. I mean, yeah, the graphics are muddy, the controls aren't great, the camera's wonky, but you know what? The combat is surprisingly fun, and the overall level design is pretty good. Now, the director's cut, Legacy of Darkness, I think deserves to be a tier higher. I was debating including just this instead of Castlevania 64 because, like I said, this is more or less an enhanced re-release of the original. In fact, it came out the same year. But I think the improvements that this version made, as well as the new additions, are enough to bring it up a tier. I think Cornell and Henry are a lot of fun to play as, I think the overall level design is better, and the gameplay is just an improvement in my opinion. So, yeah, I'm gonna put Legacy of Darkness in B. But anyway, we now move on to the PS2 generation with Lament of Innocence, which will go in B. this may surprise some of you guys, but I'm actually not the biggest fan of Lament of Innocence. It's a fun game, don't get me wrong, but to me it just felt like a poor man's Devil May Cry, and it didn't really have enough Castlevania in it. What I mean is that it came out well after the Metroidvania formula had been established for the 2D games, but it lacked a lot of the elements that made those games so much fun. Like, it has equipable armor and accessories, but no leveling system, and the different whips don't do anything except change the elemental properties of your attack, and that's even if you're able to find any of them while playing. Not to mention, the platforming is horrible, but there are still some cool things, like being able to use different attacks with your sub-weapons by combining them with the different orbs. And the way you can do any section of the castle in any order is nice, and the combat is still fun. Lament of Innocence is good, but it's not my favorite 3D game. That honor goes to our next game, Curse of Darkness, which earns its spot in the S tier. Curse of Darkness is, in my opinion, everything Lament of Innocence should have been. It brings back the leveling system, adds loads of different weapons, different armor, etc., but it also has a really fun crafting system, the environments are really cool and fun to explore, the combat is better, and the music is much better. On top of that, you also have the Innocent Devil system, which is really cool and a lot of fun to mess around with. It really is a 3D Metroidvania game with a bunch of innovative elements on top of it all. If you want a more in-depth explanation of why this game is good, I suggest watching my review for it. Speaking of games I've reviewed, next on here is Castlevania Judgment, and, yeah, I don't like this game that much. I'm gonna put it in the D tier. Judgment is an arena fighter on the Wii with art by Takeshi Obata, and it's just not what most people wanted from a 3D Castlevania game, but even when you look past that, it's just not a very good game. The balancing is terrible, the controls are awkward, the roster is small, and the character designs are just ridiculous. It can be fun at times, but these are under very strict circumstances, and there's just not much reason to play this game today. The only thing this game really has going for it is the music, and it's the only thing preventing it from falling into the E tier. So that's it for most of the 3D games, but before we move on to the Lords of Shadow series, I wanted to include Dracula X Chronicles for the PSP, which, in all honesty, by itself is probably S, but I think the extra content in this package brings it up to SS. Dracula X Chronicles is another somewhat lesser known game, and it's a 2.5D remake of Rondo of Blood for the PSP. It's a pretty faithful recreation of the original game, which, was already an amazing game, but it has some new features, like if you save Terra and Iris, you can access some new areas, there are small changes to the level design, and there are even some new bosses. I wouldn't say that alone would be enough to bring it up to SS, but what is the fact that you could still play the original game as well as Symphony of the Night in this package too. So there you have two of the best Castlevania games, and even then in Symphony of the Night they added the ability to play as Maria, which was previously only in the Saturn version. Dracula X Chronicles really just spoils you with all this content, and I think that's enough to push it up a tier. Oh, and speaking of remakes, I almost forgot about Chronicles for the PS1, which I'm gonna put in B. This is a remake of Castlevania 1 for the PS1, or, well, actually it was for the Sharp X68000, but the PS1 version was the one we got. Anyway, there's not much to say. It's a remake of Castlevania 1 with better graphics, Simon has his new red hair design, the music has been remixed, and you can now whip downward in midair. You can also control yourself mid-jump, and there are a few smaller changes here and there. It's a decent game, but it doesn't really make enough revolutionary changes for me to put it in a higher tier than Castlevania 1, so it's just gonna sit next to its older brother in B. Now we finally move on to the Lords of Shadow series, and I'm probably gonna get a lot of flack for this, but I'm really not a big fan of Lords of Shadow, so I'm just gonna keep this short and put all these games in C. I like the concepts of these games, a dark, gritty reboot of Castlevania from Western developers. I think the story is interesting, but the new style of gameplay just really takes a lot of what made Castlevania so much fun to me. I just find the overall gameplay slow, I don't like the reliance on quick time events, and Lords of Shadow 2 just somehow made things even worse. Mirror of Fate aimed to bring it back into a Metroidvania style while incorporating elements from Lords of Shadow, but I still just found it boring and tedious. These games aren't terrible, but they just lack what makes Castlevania so much fun to me, which is why I'm putting them in C. That just about covers them all, but I still have Harmony of Despair, which I think I'm gonna put in B. Harmony of Despair is kind of an oddity. It's a multiplayer-focused game where you'll go around these giant levels to fight the boss at the end, It's really unlike anything I've ever played before, and it's mostly just an asset flip of other Castlevanias, but it's a surprisingly fun game, especially with friends. Although sadly, it never got a PC port, so it'll be difficult to find enough people willing to pull out their PS3s or Xbox 360 to get a true experience, but the single player mode is still fun too. Plus, the music is awesome. Overall, this game is alright. Now, that may be it for the Castlevania series, but we're not done yet. We still have the Bloodstained series, and some people may be confused as to why I'm including these games, but really, these are Castlevania games in everything but name, and there aren't enough games in this series to make a tier list out of it, so I'm just going to be including them here. I'll start by putting the two Curse of the Moon games in B, because these are basically modern 8-bit style Castlevania games, and they really do a good job in recreating that. They're not super revolutionary or anything, but a great throwback to NES Castlevania games, and a must-play for any fan. And last but not least, we have Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. This is a game that I actually put off playing for quite a while due to, well, it being a Kickstarter project, and, you know, Kickstarter reboots of popular gaming franchises aren't exactly known to live up to expectations, but when I finally did get around to playing Bloodstained, I was pleasantly surprised. It really managed to recreate that Metroidvania-style gameplay that made the GBA and DS games so good, and it added a lot of cool new features on top of that. The graphics are great, the castle is fun to explore, the combat is excellent, and really, I'd say the only weak aspect to it is the music. Plus, the developers have been updating this game and adding tons of new content, like adding new playable characters, new modes, and addressing issues, and it's just a really good game. If you're a Castlevania fan that's been putting this game off for whatever reason, you need to play it now. And with that, we are done. As always, be sure to let me know what you guys think. Feel free to make your own tier list using the link down below in the description. Check out my other links too, and until the next video, I will see you all later.